All right, let's take a brief moment to um, go over our calendar for a moment. Oh, you guys can't see what I'm seeing. Hold on. Let me turn the screens on. All right, so let's take a moment to um, look at our calendar for the rest of the semester. We are coming up on midterms. There is not a midterm exam in this class, okay? So I do not have a midterm exam. We are just going to keep moving through. So next week is week 8 of the semester, which means that on October the 20th, by October 20th, I will turn in your midterm grades. Okay. Midterm grades are basically whatever's in the grade book. I'll add in any zeros for missing work. Midterm grades do not go on your um, transcript. It's just kind of a little bit of a wake up call to see if maybe your grade is where it's at, or maybe it's not at the place where you think it should be. All right. So um, we will. I'll have that next week. We'll go over chapter 7, and then chapter 8, 9, and 10 on the November the 4th. We will not have class that day. Okay, this week right here, the first week of November, will be an independent study week. I have a conference on the 4th, and I won't have my Tuesday night class, which means that aligns with our Tuesday and Thursday. Okay, you still have homework to do. That's the QEP, because chapter 11 is all about ethics. So there is videos for you to watch and your QEP to complete during that week that I am gone. Okay. And then we come back, and by November the 11th, um, I will have a kind of a presentation project for you all to work on. We will work on that in class on the 11th, 13th, 18th, and 20th. Okay. Um, Take that back. We will work on it in class in the 11th and the 13th. And then also we'll present on the 18th and the 20th. Okay. Um, would you all like me to get that information to you before the independent study week so that you can work on it during that week as well? Okay, I will deal. I will get that done. And then we will present the 18th and the 20th. Okay. We will not have class on the 25th. Okay, that is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Um, it is my experience that a lot of my students do not come to class that week because they either have kids that are off the whole week. So my class, this is not a St. Philip's College thing. It's a Mr. Uminsky thing. Okay, we will not have class on the 25th. I will give you that time to study for your final exam. Okay. Then on the 2nd of December, which is so hard to realize that it's just a couple weeks, a couple months away. On the 2nd of December, we will review for your final exam. Okay. And then we will take your final exam on either the 9th or the 11th, whichever one our final exam falls under. Okay. Either the 9th or the 11th. Questions, comments, concerns about the remaining 9 weeks of our semester? Yeah.
So, are we also not having class on the 6th and 27th of November with the 4th and the 25th having no class?
Yeah, so the fourth, well, the 27th is Thanksgiving, so the college is closed. And then the 6th, correct. So we're not having class on the 4th or the 6th. That week, we won't be having class. Good question. I'll make that clarification in Canvas when I update the module for that week. It's independent study all week. All right. Hard to believe, man. It's just flying by. All right. So this week we are meeting today and Thursday. Okay. And we're going to be discussing communication. So today we're going to do kind of a lecture. And then on Thursday, we're going to actually do more kind of activities dealing with communication. Okay. Um, so let's talk about communication. All right. So communication. What do you think of when you hear the word communication? Yeah. Daniel. Okay. So talking. Good. What else? Okay, so being direct. Good. I like that. Yes, sir. Okay, good. Knowing your audience. We'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. Anybody else? Who thinks they are a good communicator? See a few hands. Okay. How many think you have room to improve in your communication? Good. Awesome. Okay. So let's talk about communication. Well, actually, let me ask one more question. Why do you think communication, effective communication, is important? And we're discussing it in management and leadership. Why do you think? Yes, Rachel. No, you're not Rachel. Rachel's in my other class. You are. I did that last time. Um, okay, remind me your name, please. Karen. Dang it. Okay. Thank you, Karen. Why are we discussing this in management leadership? To be able to what? Yeah, absolutely. To be able to get our point across to our customers and our guests. And so those are what we call our external customers. We also have internal customers. Who are our internal customers? Yeah, our associates, our team members that work with us. And so that effective communication is important not only for our guests and our visitors, but also our internal customers, our associates, and our employees. Um, all right, so we already answered this question. What is communication? Some different myths about communication. I did upload this in Canvas, so if you want to follow along, you can. I'm going to bold this so it makes it a little bit easier for y'all to see. All right. So, oops, what just happened? There we go. Okay. So, some different myths about communication. I want you to read through these 5 myths about communication, and I want you to pick one that resonates with you and see if you can give me an example of why this is a myth about communication. Which one? Yes, go ahead. Okay.
Communication is not like verbal, but it shows up physically in expression.
Yeah. So, our communication is not only verbal, it is also nonverbal. So we may not even really realize that we are communicating a specific message. So let me give you an example. For the longest time, I always wore contacts. Okay. And so anytime I saw frames in my peripheral, they were always sunglasses. And one summer, I forgot my contacts. And so I was talking to somebody and I was not paying attention to what they were saying. But because I saw glasses, my face just zoned out. And they were like, "Wait, are you listening to me?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, sorry. Of course I am." But but I just realized that my facial expressions, I thought I was I really wasn't engaged in the conversation. That was obvious. I did not intend to give that communicate that message that I was not engaged in that. Who can give me another example of a time where maybe we communicated something that maybe we didn't, it wasn't our intention? Anybody? Yep, go ahead.
Maybe you're focusing on a bunch of different things, so you're not really able to give your full attention. You still are very much.
Okay, so that brings up a great point about multitasking. Okay. We are we may think we are excellent multitaskers, but in reality, we do not have the ability to focus on two things at the exact same time. Okay. And so, how many of you ever been thinking, how many of you like do your homework while you watch TV? Anybody do your homework while you watch TV? Okay. And then how many times like you stop doing your homework and you're like, wait, what just happened? And you have to rewind the show that you're watching. Anybody ever that happened to you? Happens to me all the time because I've been focusing on my homework that I can't all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, what just happened? I need to go back and rewatch this so I get caught up on all the details. So we have the ability to focus on one thing at a time. We might think that we are focusing on something and listening at the same time, but in reality, our attention is being divided. And so when we are in situations where we are supposed to communicate, right? It's a two-way street, okay? Um, Communication is I'm a sender of information, you are receivers of information. You have to process that information, and then you have to figure out how you are going to send a message back, and then I'm going to receive it. Communication is a two-way street, okay? It doesn't just go one direction. And so when we are communicating, we want to make sure that people have our full attention with that. Okay. Anybody else on any of the other four items that are up on the screen? Yeah. So that making eye contact, listening actively. What does that mean to be an active listener? How many of you have never heard the phrase active listening? Anybody? We've all heard the phrase active listening. So what does it mean? You've heard of it, but maybe you don't know what it means. So we want to have our full attention. Good. Absolutely. Okay. Yes. Acknowledging, how do we acknowledge what that other person is saying? What do you mean by reciprocate?
Concur with what they're saying, you agree, or you give your own input that is alongside of what they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes we use active listening in when we're dealing with complaints. Okay. And how we can demonstrate active listening is we rephrase what they said. Okay. It's my understanding. What I understand is that you are upset about this. Okay. That tells that person that you actually heard what they were saying. Um, and that you're actually going to try to do something to figure out what you can do to make that right. And so that's in working with either our internal customers or our external customers. Active listening is really important. Okay. So sometimes as a leader, as a manager, somebody comes into your office or someone stops you and you're on the track to go deliver a message over here, you're on the track to go do something over here, and somebody stops you and they need your attention. Okay. Sometimes it's helpful to say, if you can give me 5 minutes, I will give you my full attention, rather than just say, okay, yep, just talk to me about this, right? Um, and so oftentimes if students walk into my office, I will, if I'm working on an email, I'll ask them, can you give me about 2 minutes to finish this email? Because I can't focus on this and write my email at the same time. And so I want to be able to make sure I'm giving that full attention. Good. All right. What else? Any of the other four items on here? We talked about communications. One is a two-way street. So we can mark that one off. What else? Yes, Chad. Okay, so can you give me an example or why you think that's a myth about communication? Okay. So if we don't have enough information, we might lead to a wrong answer or a wrong conclusion. Okay. Is there a such thing as too much information? Can we give too much information? Why is that why how can we give too much information, and why is that detrimental to communication? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have that one friend that just overshares too much personal information. It's like, that's not quite appropriate, right? That is maybe that's not quite the message that we want to communicate. Okay. Um, what else? What else is an example of sharing too much information? Anybody? Yep.
I sort of something we have to recognize that they've given all the information.
Yeah, exactly. And if we give too much information, then the important message gets lost. Okay. So if I gave you a 4-page paper about a particular topic, or in this case, if I wrote a paragraph for each one of these things rather than actually just having a 1-sentence statement, too much information, the important message can get lost in that when you have too much information. I also had one time I was checking into a hotel, and um, I was checking in using my Hilton Honors, and they had me go to the front desk, which was odd because I usually just go straight to the room and use my phone to open the door. And so when I checked in, I was just curious. I said, it's interesting. I've never really had to come to the front desk. I've always just gone straight to the room. And he looked and he was like, "Oh, you have a silver status. So the status with Hilton Honors is blue, silver, gold, and platinum." And he said, "You are silver status. And so we are requiring all blue and silver status Hilton Honor members to come and check in so we can do a physical swipe of your credit cards." He's like, "We've had a lot of fraud, and people are checking in with stolen credit cards on the app. And then when we go to run them at the end, then it comes back as stolen. So we need to run your credit cards. You need to run your credit cards physically." And I was like, "Okay, cool. You could have stopped at, we need to run your credit card physically," right? Probably don't need to be telling your customers that you have a lot of fraud going on at the hotel. That's a little bit too much information. And so sometimes we do that hinders our communication. Okay. We did talk about communicating chiefly with our words. That is a myth. Who can give me an example other than like body language, or maybe facial expressions? What are some other ways that we communicate non-verbally? Through our actions? Okay, yeah. If you are consistently late to work, okay, what does that communicate to your boss? That you're unreliable, okay? Now, it could be that there is a very legitimate good reason why you are late to work. And so you may need to communicate that with your boss and say, "Look, I really love this job, but I've got to get my kid to school and the drop off line is this time. And so I know my clock in time is 9 o'clock, but I will give you 120%, but just know that I may not be able to get here until 9:15 or 9:20." Right. And so if you don't communicate that to them and you're just always late, they're going to be like, "Okay, you're just always late. I'm going to fire you." Okay. And then they may fire a really good employee. Okay. Or as a manager, as an employee, without getting too personal, you might ask them, "Hey, you know what? You are consistently late. Is there anything that is always making you late? And is there anything that I can maybe help you? Are there any resources that we have available? Maybe somebody, I don't know, maybe they lost their transportation and now they're using the bus route. And then just when the bus route runs, that's just what time they have in order to get there, right? And so um, there's all these different things that we can realize, but if we don't have those verbal conversations, then sometimes we could misinterpret the situation. All right. So different types of organizational communication. Okay, I'm going to stand up because this is bothering me. I've been sitting down, and what does that communicate to you guys? Okay, so yes, I am tired. I am perpetually tired. Okay. But what does that communicate to you as a student or as an audience member if the presenter is just sitting down? Think about that for a second. What is that? What I'm not saying anything, but my body language, my nonverbal, what does that communicate if I'm sitting behind the computer screen? Yes, Chad.
The subject of your presenting is less important than it should be.
Okay, yeah, maybe the subject is not that important, and that's not the case. Okay, good. Anybody else? How many of y'all noticed that I was sitting down? Okay, cool. So what message were you thinking? What's that? I just wanted to chill today. Yeah, okay. You're right. It's a chill day. It's okay. I mean, it's a chill day. I don't want, okay, maybe I don't want to be here. I'm just kidding. I would never say that. I would never say that. No, there are, it's interesting. There was some, my second year teaching, I had this epiphany. I was just like, you know what? Because my second year teaching, I was still really involved in the hospitality industry. And so I was just like, oh, I've got to maintain these contacts. So I'm going to cancel class, right? I canceled class a lot, even more so than I did this semester. But I canceled class a lot. And finally, one of my coworkers told me, she was like, David, you can't cancel class. You have to teach. Your students are paying tuition, and we need to make sure we're providing that education. And so I took that to heart, and I only cancel class when it's absolutely necessary. So I'm intentional with that. But also, I had that realization. It was just like you all in frontline positions, if you're not feeling well or if you're having an off day, your guest doesn't care that you're having an off day, right? You guys are students, you're paying tuition. You don't care if I'm having an off day. So it's my goal to never let you know that I'm having an off day. And so I like the fact that you thought I just wanted to chill today, and have a seat, right? And the interesting thing about that is that behavior is uncommon, right? It's a variation from my normal behavior. And so, as a manager, as a leader, sometimes we can focus and pick up on those kinds of things, right? When something happens, when something shifts and changes with our team members and our associates, again, without getting too personal, because sometimes you don't necessarily need to know all the personal details, but you can say, hey, I noticed that you were always really on time, and now you're just a few minutes late consistently. Or I noticed that you used to always be really well put together, and now sometimes your uniform is a little disheveled when you come in. Is there anything that I can do, or any resources we have available at our available to us as an organization that can help you be more successful? Okay. And so different types of communication. Think about this organizational chart that you see up on the board. Okay. Upward communication means what? What is upward communication? Let's get from somebody who hasn't. What's that? Exactly. So an employee, someone on this lower level here, may be talking to their boss, who is the supervisor of that department. Okay, so that's upward. Maybe they have a concern. Maybe they have a suggestion about something that the department or the area can do that can improve. Okay, so that's upward. What is an example of downward communication? So obviously downward is the opposite, right? We're going to go from the top down to the bottom. Who can give me an example of a downward communication? Yes, Izzy. Okay, so that's going to be lateral. So lateral is on the same level as us, right? So if I'm a server, okay, if I'm a server right here, and there's a busser, oops. and let's say the hostess. So those are all the frontline associates for the front of the house, right? And then this is our front of the house manager, dining room manager, okay? If I'm a server talking to the busser or talking to the host, that's a lateral communication. We're all at the same level. We're all frontline associates, okay? What would be an example of downward communication? So manager to the crew, okay? Managers to the associates. Can you give me an example of what something that the manager might communicate to the frontline associates?
They work in retail, they do like weekly meetings to set up like what the new front end is like, what the new outline, what sales, like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have those either weekly meetings. Sometimes, anybody ever been a server before? We have our stand-up meeting, our pre-shift meeting. Okay, what kind of information is the manager communicating to the team during the pre-shift meeting? Any specials that are coming up or that we're serving that day? Okay, how can our servers sell a special if they don't know about it? How does our retail frontline staff know what the front of the store is supposed to look like if that information has not been communicated? Okay, and that typically comes from the top, so that's a downward communication within the organization. Some different barriers to effective communication. Let me bold these as well. So I'm going to use that as a perfect example for a barrier to communication. Can you guys see that okay? How about now? Is that better? There we go. Is that better? All right. Okay. And then I feel like I'm in an eye doctor right now. Is number one or number two better? Is number two or number three better? Right. So now we've taken out the glare of the lights, but what's the potential issue with this situation? You guys can't write and you might fall asleep. So I don't want to do that. Okay. So what do you think are some barriers? Are there any barriers that are listed up here that you find that you have encountered in communication, and how has it hindered, how has it affected your communication? Yes. Okay, misinterpretation. Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes misinterpretation occurs, especially if we're in situations like if we're using any kind of industry jargon that we use on, like, on our side that our guest maybe doesn't quite understand. They may misinterpret that. One of the biggest misinterpretations in hotels that we have is when guests ask for a connecting room. Okay, they want a connecting room, meaning that there's a door that actually connects, right? And but we also have adjacent and adjoining, right? So in the industry, adjoining is a room that are side by side, but there's no door that connects. And then adjacent just means it's somewhere nearby. So it could be across the hall from each other. And so adjacent means right next to it. So that guests, when they're making the reservation, they may say, I want an adjacent room. Okay, that's great. And then when they check in, they have an adjacent room, but there's no door connecting. And then they're like, wait a minute, I asked for a room that had doors connecting, right? And so we want to make sure that we're understanding that that's a misinterpretation that could affect the guest service experience. What else? Anybody want to touch stereotyping and how that affects communication and effective communication? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So somebody might look at you and think, okay, you're a student, which you are a student, but they may not necessarily take the information that you're having seriously or as important. I remember one time I walked over to the welcome center. This is like my first or second, I think it was my first semester teaching. And I walked over to the welcome center and I needed to talk to an advisor. And the person at the front desk was like, okay, well, go get one of those pink slips over there and fill it out. And I was like, pink slip? I just got hired. You're already firing me? And she was like, oh, you're a student, you're a faculty. I was like, yes, I'm a faculty member. So yeah, sometimes that. Also, too, as a server, I used to my colleagues that were serving with me, they hated waiting on older couples or older people, right? They were just like, oh, there's old people got sat in my section because the stereotype that they had was that old people don't tip, right? And I was like, well, if you give them exceptional service, then maybe they'll tip, you know? And so anytime somebody, I loved getting people like that in my section, and they're like, oh, they're always so grumpy. And I'm like, they're just old. Like that's just how they look. Like, let's see if we can get them to smile. Let's see if we can get them to crack a smile. Kind of took it as a challenge. So that stereotyping, that if you have that in mind and you walk up to that table, well, how are you going to behave when you walk up to that table as a server? If you have that in your mind, okay. I remember also too when I used to teach fifth grade outdoor ed every year. I worked for Houston ISD, and so every year we get the same schools that would come back. And there were some schools that maybe were a little more rambunctious or maybe had a few more discipline problems than others. And I remember in my second year, somebody was like, oh, the school's coming back. And I was like, hold on. Unless these kids are repeating the fifth grade, these are different kids. So these are different kids, and we can't just judge based on what the kids did last year on what they're going to do this year. And if we go in expecting them to have issues, then we're going to be looking for those behavioral issues and we're going to find them. And then it's going to be an issue and then it's going to be a stressful week for all of us. So why don't we just go with an open mind and see what we can do to try to avoid making those stereotypes? Okay. Um, Anything else? Barriers to effective communication. Anything up there that you want to talk about?
Arrogance is
Okay, so what do you mean by that? Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I like that. You know, it's interesting. I went to a conference this last week, and on the last day, on Friday, there was a guy giving a presentation. And granted, we had started the presentation late. And so while he was on stage giving his presentation, he got a text message from somebody he was supposed to be in a meeting with on Zoom. And he literally just on the stage was like, hold on, guys, let me go ahead and send this text message. I'm supposed to be on this meeting. And he was basically reading his text message out loud. Now, the students that I was there with found that to be fairly offensive. Like you're not, I'm not going to take your presentation seriously any longer because you're not taking your presentation seriously, right? Now, in his defense, it was a conference for people that were really high up in different tourism organizations. And he had a meeting with somebody it was a really important meeting. But because our timing was off, then he even admitted, I scheduled my meetings too close. Um, and so let me send a text message, let him know I'm going to log on in about 15, 20 minutes. Um, and most of the people in the room kind of laughed it off because they could probably see themselves to be in the same situation. But my students took it as arrogance, took it as, wow, this guy just really isn't paying attention to, and delivering his best in the presentation. And to be honest, his presentation was not all that great to begin with. It wasn't all that engaging to begin with. So I think that was just kind of like the final straw. But that is, if you go up there with "I am the end all be all," and when no matter what you say, it's not going to be true, then that turns people off, and then they're no longer listening. Yeah. What else? Inarticulateness. Okay. What does that? What does that mean, and why is that a barrier to communication?
Say what it is that you're trying to say, like it's not coming out right.
Right.
You know, it's one of those moments where I'm talking and just the words aren't coming out of my face right.
Yeah.
So opposite or words aren't happening.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so one thing that's not on here that is a barrier to effective communication, I think that you just touched on, is emotions. Sometimes our emotions can cause us to have that to be a barrier to how we communicate effectively. How many have ever been like really how many of you have ever had this situation, and be honest, where you had to have a conversation with somebody and you planned that whole conversation out in your mind? You're like, I'm going to walk up and she's going to say this, and then I'm going to say this, and then she's going to say this in return, and then I'm going to say this, and then she's going to say this, and this is how this conversation is going to go. Right? First of all, when you get in that situation, your emotions are already somewhat high, right? And you've already planned out what that person has said. So, what happens if that person doesn't say what you think they're going to say? What happens to the rest of the energy that you spent planning that conversation out? It's wasted, right? And so when we do that, and I'm guilty of it, okay, I'm gonna put both hands up because I'm guilty of doing that. Um, but when we do that, that is a barrier to effective communication because I'm not listening to what that person is saying. I already know what they're going to say. And so I'm already working on my response in my head to respond to what they're going to say. And so I'm not actively listening. I'm not listening to that what actually is happening. Okay. What else? Anything else that's not up on here, or that is on here that you want to touch on? Personality. Okay. Yeah. How is that a barrier to communication?
You totally and they're talking and they're trying to give you some information, but the person that you're talking to is more needed to shut off everything. They're not really touching everything you're saying because they might just like person.
Yeah, that person is super overly excited, right? If they use their hands a lot when they talk, that can sometimes distract from the message that you're trying to give. I remember one time, I talked about this in my professionalism class. I went to a high school debate or a high school competition, and they had the president of the high school associate, like the student president of the association that was presenting. And when he got up there, he gave a speech. And when he said it, he said this sentence, he went like this. And when he said this sentence, he went like this. And then occasionally he would use both hands because somebody told him this was what you do when you say something really important. So this is important. This is also important. This is really important. And the whole time that I'm sitting there, I'm like, I have no idea what he's saying because I'm just focused on the fact that somebody has told this poor young man that this is how you effectively communicate. And it's like, no, that's I guess yes, in a way you can do that. Um, but yeah, it was just like I was like, man, I have no idea what this young man just said because I was so focused on his hands and that it was so distracting. So the other thing also too, when I want to talk about is communication is when our verbal communication, it involves our tone, involves our volume. It involves the speed or the tempo in which we speak. Okay. And so if I am someone who speaks relatively quickly, it's hard to understand because because you can't focus on what they're saying because they've already kind of moved on. My dad hates it when I listen to my podcast at like 1.5 and 2 point, like 2 speed, because I just want to get through a podcast and I'm listening to it and he's like, I have no idea what these people are saying. And so speed and tempo is important. If I talked like this and I came in and gave class and talked like this and did a presentation with this volume, what does this volume communicate to you as a listener? It's a secret. Okay. Yeah. This is super important. Okay. What else? What else does that communicate to you? I'm nervous. Okay. And that might be okay. Maybe you don't know what you're talking about. You're not as confident in the material, right? When you are giving a presentation, you should be the expert in that information because you put that presentation together. And so when you are doing that, you can convey confidence by your body language, by the tone of your voice, by making eye contact with the audience. All those things communicate when it comes to giving presentations.
Still somebody's something.
Okay, the telephone game where you whisper something to somebody and then they whisper to the next person, that eventually it gets all messed up. Yeah, that is a great example of how communication can spread, and also how one person can say something a little bit off, and then that message continues, which is different from the original message. So absolutely, that's a great example. Um, different personal spaces, or sorry, different interpersonal. So interpersonal means between individuals, between people. Okay. Intimate space is that very close. Personal space is between about 1.5 feet. Okay. Some people refer to that personal space as their own personal bubble. Okay. This is my bubble. I don't want anybody inside my bubble. Okay. Those are the people who do not like to give hugs. Hugs are really actually more like the intimate space. In our industry, we are a people industry. So oftentimes in traditional business, you're going to shake hands. Okay, so that is that personal and or social space that you're shaking hands. Oftentimes people will give hugs to say hello. If you know somebody, there have been situations where I know like 3 out of the 4 people in a group, and I give that fourth person a hug, and it's really awkward because I don't really know them, right? But I'm just like, I've given these 3 people a hug, and so I don't know. Do I hug you? Do I shake hands? Like, what do I do at that awkward moment? But usually shaking hands is the best way. The public space would be kind of where you all are. You're in the public space compared to me. And so as we get further away from the individual, our communication is going to change. The tone of our voice may change, the volume of our voice when we are speaking with somebody right in front of us. I don't have to use the same volume as if I'm trying to talk to Andrew in the back row, okay, to make sure that he can hear all the information. And so, that's really important to understand, because if you are speaking too loudly to somebody in front of you, then that could also be a barrier to that communication. Okay. How many of you try to avoid people in your personal bubble, in your personal space? That's totally fine. That's totally fine, right? That's why it's called personal space. That's your area. Um, so we just need to be cognizant of that. All right, we already talked about most of these, except for pauses. Okay, silence can be a verbal communication. How can silence be a verbal communication? Yeah. So if they're sitting there, look, if you ask someone a question and then it's silent, they maybe are communicating that they don't maybe understand the question that you asked, or maybe you have to reword it in a different way. What else? How else can silence communicate? Yes.
Say that but if they were talking to you and discussing something with you like plans or something, and you just didn't say no, and you're just like,
Okay, yeah. So it could mean agreement, right? I don't have any objection to what you just proposed. So okay, let's go. Let's meet for lunch next week. Let's put it on our calendar. Absolutely. Good. Anybody else? Yes. Absolutely. Good. Good, good. I use sometimes, and I'm going to give my secret away, but that's okay because this is a second year class and you guys probably aren't going to have me for class anymore. But sometimes I use silence if somebody's not paying attention. I will just stop talking. And then all of a sudden, those people who aren't paying attention are like, wait, what's going on? Like, why isn't there anybody talking? Was a question asked? Do I need to answer something? Right. And so sometimes that silence can be a way to start a conversation and draw people back into the focus. Um, for presentations, and we'll use this in your group presentation project. There needs to be some kind of introduction, just like in a written paper. There needs to be some kind of introduction that's going to introduce what you're going to be talking about. It might be the three like key points or three or four key points for the presentation, and then you can go into more detail. Of course, the main body is going to be each one of those individual slides. I have a professor that's always told me, he said, slides are free. Okay. Slides are free. You can have as many slides as you want. If it means that you are going to have one piece of information on that slide and it's really big so people can see it, that's fine. Slides are free. And then have that conclusion to kind of wrap things up to make sure that we are all good to go. I remember one time I was in a leadership class and we had to give a presentation to somebody here at the college. And so they asked me to put together the presentation. And so I did. And I think we had 5 minutes to do our presentation. And I had about 12 slides. Okay. And they're like, David, nope, that's not going to work. 12 slides is way too many for a 5 minute presentation. I got a little defensive. I was like, why are you wasting my time? If you don't want me to do my slides the way that I would do them, and I can guarantee you we'll get it done in 5 minutes, then why waste my time in asking me to do the slides? You should have just done them yourself to begin with. And so they were literally like, we were going to run through our slides an hour before the meeting, and they were all scrambling. And they're like, oh my gosh, we have to redo these slides now, blah, 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 whatever. And I was like, hey guys, could you just take a few minutes and let me walk you through the slides? Because all they were focused on was 12 slides, right? I finished the presentation in 3.5 minutes. And they're like, oh, you can do it in 5 minutes. Yes, you can. I practiced it. I promise. And I was like, if you're only focused on one piece of information, oh, there's 12 slides. We can't, there's no way we could do 12 slides in 5 minutes. Then guess what? You're never going to do 12 slides in 5 minutes. You're going to be so focused on that. And then they were literally ready to scrap. Now, granted, it didn't take me long to do all the work because I used the designer in PowerPoint. It looks more impressive than it actually was. But I was just like, they're ready to scrap the entire thing and start new with an hour left before the meeting, just because they were focused on 12 slides. Yes, Karen. Yeah, right. So like that, what they wanted to have, like what I would maybe split onto 3 slides, they would put on one slide, and then they would talk about those 3 things versus, okay, I want you to focus on this one at a time. I don't want you to be focused on too much information. This one thing at one at a time, and then move to the next slide and move to the next slide. I took the same amount of time to talk about those 3 slides as it was if it was on one slide. It's just the information was clearer because the person that was watching was only looking at one piece of information at a time. They weren't trying to look at a bunch of paragraphs and a bunch of words on a slide. So remember, slides are free. Okay. You can put as whatever information you want on those slides. As leaders, I think I'm checking my time to make sure. Ooh, wait, we have 20 minutes, right? Okay. I was thinking we only had 5 minutes. You guys, you're thinking you can keep thinking we have 5 minutes left. So effective feedback. This I think is really important for this particular class as management and leadership. Okay. What does it mean by feedback is well timed? Because we can't always give immediate feedback, right? Immediate feedback is not always right now. We just made an error. Okay. Our associate just made an error. Right now is not the moment, right? They've got a line of 6 guests to check out. So I can't correct that behavior right now because I don't want to do it in front of guests because then that puts that person in an awkward situation. Okay. So I want to figure out a time later that I can address this. But sometimes we can make it immediate. Oh my gosh, you are getting ready to touch that without hot pads. Or you only folded your towel once. You should fold it 2 times and then made it into thirds to make it a hot pad to pull that. So immediately, yes, I need to get that for safety reasons. I need to address that right then and there. So you don't hurt yourself, you don't hurt somebody else. But sometimes it also just needs to be well timed for later on. So what is that? Who can give me an example? I kind of gave you a couple, but who can give me an example of well timed information? Yeah. Okay, good. Moses, you did a comment?
Yeah, Mr. Brown.
Okay. We can't tell you right now, right? Okay. So the information was based on the information and the security level of that. We couldn't necessarily develop that information. As a leader giving feedback to somebody, okay, if an error happens, okay, I'm going to pick on Jake for a second. Sorry, Jake. So if Jake makes a mistake, okay, I just wanted to say that just because it rhymes. Um, if Jake makes a mistake and Zach is the leader, right? Zach sees the mistake happen, okay, and it doesn't say anything. And then 2 weeks goes by and Jake makes the same mistake. Can Zach go back and be like, dude, you keep making the same mistake? No, you can't be like, hey, 2 weeks ago you made this mistake. That's not effective in giving that feedback. Okay. Like, I can't remember your name. I'm so sorry. Remind me your name, please. Samantha. Like Samantha said, tomorrow, maybe later in the shift, as Jake's getting ready to check out. Hey Jake, I saw that you made this mistake. Let's go ahead and let's see what we can do to correct it. Okay. When I was a server at TGI Fridays, it was my first job ever waiting tables. Okay. And back then I was not very cultured, so I didn't understand the difference between a medium well and a medium rare steak. I very rarely ate steak to begin with. And so I didn't understand the difference of temperatures. And so I'd always forget to ask my guests how they wanted their steak cooked. And so then I'd be at my computer and I'd be like, they look like a medium. It's middle of the road. Okay. Some pink, not a lot of pink, but some people who want medium rare don't want it cooked medium. They want it less done, right? Or somebody who wants it well done wants no pink. So I didn't understand this. So I had a lot of remakes, a lot of steaks that had to be remade because I would feel embarrassed that I forgot to ask my guest, right? I didn't want to walk back to the table. So at the computer, I just put something in. And my manager, Kristen, she was like, David, we got to figure this out. We keep wasting steaks. Okay. And so she gave me a neon pink index card and I taped it on the inside of my little server checkbook. And it said meat temperature. That's all it said. And so as I'm writing out the orders, I see this neon pink thing in the corner. It says meat temperature. Oh, yeah, I got to remember to ask people how they want their steak prepared. Okay. That feedback, if she didn't correct it, then eventually get to be a problem that I'm wasting so much money that I'd probably get fired. Okay. And so that third bullet point, considering the needs of the receiver, Kristen had to understand that I don't eat steak. Okay. One of my biggest pet peeves when I used to work at a ranch with the bartenders is they would open up, we served the St. Genevieve wine. Okay. Now, St. Genevieve wine is not a top tier wine, shall we say? Okay, and on top of that, it was like the 1.5 liter bottles. It was the giant bottles of wine, and these bartenders would just open up bottles, and I'm like, guys, we have 40 people here. They're not going to drink all those wine, and you're just going to put it back in the cooler. And then in a week, you're going to open it up again and try to serve it and tell people it's Texas wine, and people are going to hate Texas wines. They're like, well, I don't open bottles very well, and I don't want to open in front of a guest. So I just do it before the event starts. And I'm not a big wine drinker. Okay, great. You don't have to be a wine drinker to be a bartender, but you have to understand wine. You have to understand the product that you're selling or you're serving. And so it took me a while to say, okay, maybe it's the wine openers. Not everybody is really comfortable using the waiter's corkscrew. Okay. And so we got those ones that have the little wings that you twist and then the wings come up and then you pull them down. That's a lot easier to open. And so we implemented that and we wasted less wine. Okay. And so understanding the needs of who the receivers are allows you to be a better communicator and give feedback more effectively. Okay. We talked about different types of listening. We talked about active listening, but when we are listening, we're evaluating information. So I'm going to give you information. You have to evaluate it and figure out how do you interpret that. Okay. I'm going to give you informational listening. Okay. So I'm going to give you information. And maybe it's directions on a homework assignment or directions on a project. Okay. You are listening only for information, nothing else. And then empathetic. What does empathetic mean? What does empathy mean? Feeling for what they're saying, understanding how that person might be feeling or interpreting, or maybe put yourself in their situation. Okay. So if for whatever reason, let's say a guest comes up and is complaining and they're really upset because the room's not ready, or they have the wrong room type. Let's say you gave them 2 beds instead of 1 king bed. They're really upset. And then you realize, oh my gosh, it's midnight. They just got in. Their luggage was lost by the airline. So they're not complaining necessarily about the fact, like they're not upset at you as the individual. They've got a lot of situations going on. So how would you feel if you traveled for 12 hours that day and you got to your destination and your luggage wasn't there, right? And so that empathetic listening, we might, let's say at the front desk, we may have little toolkits or little like hospitality kits that says, somebody checked in without their luggage because the airline lost their luggage. So sorry that you experienced that. Here's a little tool. Here's a little kit. It's all put together. It's got toothpaste, a razor. It's got toothbrush, maybe a little small hairbrush or whatever. Here's this little kit. I hope this helps you, ties you over until your luggage can get here, right? That empathetic listening can change the situation. It really kind of helps that person realize that you are actually listening to what they're saying. The last thing is written communication. Okay. The last thing is written communication. In business writing, you want to know who your audience is. If I send an email to someone who I've known for a long time, I may include some emojis. I may put a smiley face in there. I may use exclamation points. But if it's somebody who I've never interacted with before, I use a very professional business tone. Okay. I also want to be very direct. Okay. Sometimes people don't have a lot of time to read a long email. Or sometimes they don't have the time to read a long letter. Okay. And so you want to be very direct. You want to be very intentional with the words that you're using. You want to try to avoid using any kind of jargon that maybe the other person wouldn't know, because that leads to that misinterpretation. Okay. We want to avoid using cliches. What is a cliche? How many of you have ever heard the word cliche? The phrase, like, oh, that's such a cliche. What is a cliche? Anybody? What's that? Birds of a feather flocks together. It is what it is. Tomorrow's another day. They have no meaning, right? They really have no, they're just like extra fluff words, right? And cliches also are, you want to avoid cliches are kind of also a little bit borderline not stereotypes, but they are kind of generalizations as well. So you want to kind of try to avoid any of that. Um, one thing that I thought was interesting is I used to always start my emails with good morning or good afternoon or good evening based on when I was reading the email or when I was writing the email. But somebody shared with me one time, they're like, David, this person may not be writing or reading this email in the morning. They may not be reading this email in the evening. If you're sending it to if I'm sending an email in the afternoon to somebody in California, it may be 12 o'clock here, but it's still 10 o'clock there. And so I don't think it really makes that big of a difference, but it's just that attention to detail. Then rather than saying a specific time of the day, just a general hello um, type of general greeting is helpful. Last two things is email communication. How many of you are really, really great at sending emails? I see some okays. Good. Cool. How many of you feel like you need some help writing emails? How many of you avoid writing emails? Why do you avoid writing emails? Not everybody checks them. That's a very good point. I have 6 different email addresses that come to my phone. If I didn't have them, if I didn't have them on my phone, you think I'm checking 6 different individual email boxes every single day? No, I'm not. All right. And so on average for my work email, I get anywhere between, I would say, 50 to 60 emails a day. On my personal email, it's mostly junk email, anywhere between 100 to 120 emails a day. And so, yeah, sometimes it gets buried and we miss it. So sometimes it's easier just to call somebody. Sometimes it's easier to call somebody or text them. Okay. You might text them, but my friends, I still do professional writing in my text messages. I use periods, I use commas. Um, I start at hello. I sign my name. I don't sign my name on every single one of them, but sometimes I will. Okay. But when we're sending an email, if we're sending it to the same people, right? If everyone is addressed, we might put multiple people in that to field. Okay. Anybody else that we want to see that email, but maybe it's not addressed to them, but be aware of the information, we also are going to put them in that courtesy copy, that CC. Okay. That means if that person that we sent it to, if they reply, it'll reply just to me, the sender. If they reply all, it will send it to everybody that's listed. Okay. Now, we also have a blind carbon copy. That's BCC. Who has seen BCC? Who has not seen BCC? Okay, sometimes it's hidden. You actually have to click on it to show it. But BCC, blind carbon copy, means you're going to carbon copy somebody on that email, but the people you send it to are not going to see that email address. Okay. And the way I use that in business is when I was working I use it to protect the privacy of the people that I'm sending the email to. So when I was a wedding planner, I go to the wedding show and I talk to 60 different brides and I want to schedule information. I want to schedule appointments. I want to send them the information, but I don't want them to see each other's email addresses, right? I want to protect their privacy. So I'll send the email to myself and then I'll BCC all of those email addresses. So that way everybody gets the email. I send it one time. I don't send it 60 individual times. Everyone gets it, and then they can reply to me if they want to set up an appointment. Okay. You could also use BCC in a little bit of a mischievous way. Like, let's say you're having a conflict with an associate, a team member, and you want your boss to kind of know what's going on, be aware of the situation, but you don't want that coworker to know that the boss knows the situation. You might BCC your boss, okay? And then that way, if that coworker starts complaining to your boss about you, they're already a little bit aware of the situation, okay? We have to be careful with that, though. You have to use that very sparingly because you don't want to be the person who is always constantly sharing unnecessary information with your supervisors or your bosses. Okay. And you may even ask them in advance. You may have a conversation with them and say, this is really happening between me and this other individual. I want to try to work it out. I'm going to send them an email. Do you mind if I blind carbon copy or courtesy copy you? So that way they're kind of aware that it's going to happen. Okay. Why do we not want to write in all capital letters? What does all capital letters mean? We're yelling or screaming or shouting. Okay. So we want to try to avoid that. We might have one word as like emphasis, but if we put it all in caps, then that is someone who is yelling and people are just like, no, I'm not going to listen to that. Okay. I like that first one. Attach the attachments. Has anybody ever sent an email and you forget to attach the attachment, or you get an email and the email says refer to the attachment and there's no attachment? Okay, that happens quite frequently. So make sure that if you do attach something, Microsoft Outlook is actually pretty good. If you type in something and then you go to send it, it might pop up an error message and be like, wait, did you mean to attach something? Because there's nothing attached to this email. So that's really helpful. Be like, oh yeah, I forgot to do that. It's important that you read your message before you send it. Okay. I am somebody who likes to go very quickly. I don't do things slowly. So it's really sometimes I have to stop back and reread it to make sure I don't have any spelling errors or things like that. Okay. I don't typically use grammar like spell check, but there is a spell check option if you're going to use it. Oftentimes it'll give you that little red squiggly line, so you can right click on it. You can update the spelling, right? What does that mean by think before you send? Think before you send. Okay, so maybe try to remove emotions out of a situation. Good. Make sure it's relevant. Sometimes we might send an emotional email and we can't get that back once we sent it. Okay. And so sometimes if we're really passionate about something, maybe somebody did like a coworker offended us, or maybe we got in an argument with somebody, I'm going to send them an email. You might type that email out and just let it sit. Okay. That's like the email version of count to 10 in your head before you respond. Better yet, excuse me, better yet, type it into a Word document. Don't type it in an email because then what could happen? You could accidentally send it. Okay. I have my shortcuts turned on, and if I hold down control and hit enter, it sends the email, right? Because I don't want to have to stop typing, get my mouse, click send, and move on to the next thing. I just type my email, control enter, and it sends the email, right? But there are sometimes when I'm typing so fast that I accidentally hit control send and my email gets sent. And then I have to go back and figure that out. So think before you send, read before you send it, and then maintain the thread. Okay. You'll realize this in business. Think about it as like a group text, group text message. You want to maintain that thread because, especially when it comes to like catering or event planning, it's really helpful to have that full thread so that you can go back and refer to it when the client comes back and says, "Oh no, we were supposed to have chicken, and why do we have brisket?" And then you can go back to that thread and say, "Oh yes, we had chicken, but back here on November the 2nd, here's your email that said you wanted to switch to brisket." right? And so maintaining that thread allows you to keep all that information together. Okay. Any questions, comments, concerns about communication? In the last 3 minutes of class, I want you to think of one piece of information that stood out for you today. One piece of information. I'm going to ask every single person. So I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to think about one piece of information that was either new or interesting or you had never really considered before as far as communication. Okay. And we're going to start, and you cannot repeat what somebody else said. We want to start right here. We'll start right here in the front row. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Some people have what we call RBF. Okay, so we want to try to avoid RBF. Does anybody not know what RBF is? It's resting bee face. I'm not going to say the word, but sometimes we have that, and we have to realize what our facial expressions are. Okay, good. Go ahead. BCC. Okay, cool. Body language is important. Yes. Two. Okay. Yeah. It could lose that message. Good. Yeah, absolutely. Silence can be communication. Good. Absolutely. Maintain those threads and emails. Yeah, empathy goes a long way in customer service. Okay, yeah, be more open-minded. Don't make preconceived decisions about somebody without actually interacting with them. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, excellent. Awesome. Zach, okay, good. The organizational communication, the different types of communications we have. Okay, good, good. The different barriers to communication. Good. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. Double checking to make sure everything looks great. Good. Slides are free. Okay, so this side of the room, you can repeat something. Okay, how many people are stressing out? Be like, oh my gosh, they took mine. They took mine. They took mine. They took mine. Okay, you can repeat. Okay, go ahead. Absolutely. Good. Barriers to communication. There's a lot of different things that go into sending a message and or receiving. Good. Yeah. Avoid those cliches. Jake. Yeah. Sometimes we have to learn those things, right? We may not be the most positive, the most outgoing person, but for work we can. And then as soon as we clock out, then I can go back to being a little bit more reserved. Yes. Last three. Okay. Good. Excellent. Yeah. Absolutely. And last. Good. thorough and keeping it to the point. And I will say one last thing. I know I'm over. I apologize. But one thing that you can do to help be more empathetic, one thing you can do to be a little bit more professional is copy your text into ChatGPT or Google Gemini and say, can you help me make this sound more professional? Can you help me make this sound more empathetic? Right? But don't just rely on that. Read what the response is. And then that way you learn how to then write it yourself in the future more professionally, more empathetically. So compare what you did and compare the response and figure out what you can do to get this response the first time. All right. Thank you all so much. I'll see you on Thursday and we will do some activities about communication. I'm looking forward to it. It's one of my favorite days of this